We are live.
Welcome to Explore Simplexity podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic of nationalism, where it comes from, and if it's outdated or not, what are its uses, what are its dangers, just kind of exploring the idea of nationalism.
Yeah, I actually don't know a lot about it, so I hope I can learn a lot from you today.
Yeah.
One of the few things, again, it's a civilization, Sid Meier's civilization analogies. Nationalism gives you access to like fascist government. So is that related?
For sure.
Yeah.
So we could start out with a definition, or we could like discuss it chronologically through time.
I like to do the chronological thing.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. So roughly speaking, people start out living in tribal societies. You know, you have your tribe of like 200 people that you know your whole life, and that's your worldview. I mean, there are other tribes you go to war with, but that's like that's your world.
So is your world essentially your nation, or is that like a larger? Like, is a nation just a bigger tribe?
Good question.
Okay.
So after the invention of agriculture, then people started living in larger communities, like cities or kingdoms. And historically speaking, like in the Bible, for example, where it talks about make disciples of all nations, a nation is both an ethnic group and a linguistic group. Because historically speaking, ethnicity and language were the same thing. So like in the Japanese people speak Japanese and the German people speak German. And so that's the archaic idea of a nation is both this ethnic and cultural dovetailing.
Yeah. And perhaps some sort of threshold on the size. Or maybe is a nation also maybe like a combination of multiple villages and tribes that share these same cultures and languages?
Well, so that's starting to get into the state, which is the idea of like a legal or political entity rather than like a racial or cultural category. So you have nation in terms of like culture and ethnicity, but then you from the city states you also have kingdoms, and that comes from the idea of a king, and so the sovereignty of the king is what defines the political unit. And there could be different tribes, different communities within a kingdom, and then you have an empire, which is a collection of different kingdoms.
I see. Okay, so but the important part of the nation is some kind of like cultural and ethnic identity.
Historically. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. And then that...
And the reason this is important is because, you know, we grew up in this Western democracy, and like what we've known our whole lives, it's what our parents have known their whole lives. And so we take for granted that, you know, well, obviously the state is a representative democracy with, you know, different states and different representatives, a judiciary branch. Like, actually, it's really complicated, and it comes from like thousands of years of, let's call it political legal evolution.
Right. Interesting. So like I know about like the Greek Empire, right? They had like Athens and Troy and these different
City-states, yeah.
But they were still under, would it be the nation of Greece?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, sort of. So politically they had city-states, and that's where we get the word citizen. Like you're from the city if you're part of that. Like, or the polis, right? Your identity is associated with the city. Which is, and Greece is an interesting example because each city-state had drastically different governments and what we call cultures in terms of like expectations and behaviors, but they had a shared identity in terms of their language. So I guess it's kind of like the United States in the sense that like New York culture is very different from Texas, which is very different from California.
Right.
We all speak English, but we have these different political groups and cultures within those categories.
Right. I also think in terms of just like having the, you know, the Greek Empire as a whole, or kingdom, or whatever you want to call it, it's also like a division of labor. So like, you know, Sparta was like the warrior city-state, and that's what they did. Maybe we can make an analogy. Like California is like the tech output state of the United States. And got different kind of agriculture in different states, and everything's kind of has its own.
It's tricky,
own
and
thing.
and so we talked about doing a reverse metaphors, where you take something in the present and use it as a metaphor to describe something in the past, which can work, but it also has a danger of misunderstanding the past.
Right. Okay. I won't go down that road.
No, it's good. It's useful. But the reason I'm saying is because just be aware that that's what's happening.
Yeah.
Right? So you can use a metaphor as long as you're aware it's a metaphor and not the truth.
Sure. Gotcha. Yeah, I guess, I took for granted, like, when I hear nation, I just immediately think of a country. Like, it's like an interchangeable, like the UN, the United Nations, and they're just like different countries in this United Nations. But it seems like there's a little more into it. At least in terms of the historical context.
Yeah, for sure. And just a quick narrative, or what do you call it? Quick story. I remember I was a kid and I thought, okay, Ford, that's an American car. And then Toyota, okay, that's a Japanese car. And BMW is a German car. And I'm like, what's the Mexican car? And I just thought every nation had its own car. And then I realized some nations don't have cars. That's weird. Why is that?
Yeah, interesting.
And that was kind of like this wake-up moment for me.
Yeah. But you made that association naturally because it kind of made sense. You saw a pattern of different cars with different kinds of names.
Right.
Mitsubishi, it's Japanese or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and talking about the Olympics, right? That's kind of like these national competitions. So it is an interesting idea. Like, what does it mean to be a nation? What does it mean to be a country? What does it mean to be a state?
Yeah, and there's probably gray lines in between when things are happening, or when people don't agree that they want to be in the same nation.
Right. And I think we talked about this previously, like during colonial times, right? These colonial powers would come in and they'd say, okay, here's my colony. And then, okay, here's your colony. But within my colony, there are like 8 different tribes and like 12 different languages and like different religions. So there's a political boundary that's created, an economic political boundary, but the culture is just chaos. And what happened frequently what happens after the colonial power backed off, then you see this tribal warfare that happened. So for example, in India, that's one of the most famous. India got its independence from Britain. And immediately there was a fight that broke out between Muslims and Hindus. And they're like, we should be together. That was what Gandhi wanted. Right. But then the Muslims were like, no, we want our own country. And the Hindus were like, fine, well, we'll have our own country. It was essentially a civil war.
Right.
And so it's interesting how people organize themselves.
Yeah. And just to go even further back, from what I understand too, like this organization of people and tribes, didn't that kind of start with like the agriculture? Once you started like having large plots of land where you could grow, and then that can support a large population. Now all of a sudden, you need to manage things on a bigger scale. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because before, I guess it was just tribal, and then there was just some alpha male or something. That was the organization. That's it.
Yeah. Well, and also what happens is empires, or kingdoms for that matter, will develop some sort of standardization. And it could be a standardization of language or of currency or of measurement. And all these things are pragmatic and they facilitate trade, but it also creates this like new identity. And it's interesting how those things evolve over time.
I wonder too, like if you are like an agricultural society and you're growing all of these crops, you probably have raider tribes too that come in and like take your shit.
Yeah.
And maybe that could also be a reason, like, hey guys, we gotta like form together and have like watch each other's backs, and then that can also bring a larger group of people together.
100%, and that's why most ancient cities had city walls. It's like, if barbarians come, everyone goes into the walls. We protect our own.
Yeah, and I could really see how that could also foster an idea of a nation, like we are together and united. Against like other people coming in and taking stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting how that kind of conflict actually generates that kind of unity among large number of people.
It can.
It can, right? It's like if there's a common adversary, everyone can get behind, like, let's fight this.
And that's exactly what happened with the Greeks too. So they had, these like fractured Greek city states, and then the Persian Empire comes creeping up on the border. They're like, okay guys, we got to stick together or we're getting wiped out.
Right. That is interesting to think about. Okay, so I think I got a better idea of what we're talking about when we talk about a nation. And then, so your original thing you wanted to discuss was nationalism.
Yeah.
So that's another ism, I guess.
Yeah, and that's more of a modern thing. It's interesting because a lot of governments have, let's say, an aristocracy or ruling class. Like this is explicit in a monarchy, right? The kingdom is the head of state. So you have the aristocracy and the ruling class, and then typically you have the peasants or the working class. And well, in India, they have like the caste system. So it's like a very rigid class society. So that's the typical way of organizing society. And in the heroic age, right, the aristocrats were the heroes. And you see that in the Middle Ages too, where, the noblemen were the knights. So the force, the political force, and the political power was all managed by the aristocracy. And then when you get into the industrial age, something interesting happens because you have conscription, where the common people are in the military, and you have democracy, where the common people are voting and have some political power. And different people debate about like the evolution of nationalism, but I think a key person in the evolution of nationalism is Napoleon Bonaparte.
Okay.
Because he marks, well, at least in France, the end of monarchy, by off with your head means.
Okay.
In Britain, it kind of slowly evolved into a democracy, but in the French Revolution, it was a lot more abrupt.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, France, or Napoleon, however you want to think about it, spread this idea of the Napoleonic Code. And there are all sorts of wars in Europe for about 100 years. And it wasn't until it was 1871 when both Germany and Italy became nations. And there was like this unification, and they became both political and economic units. And that, to me, that moment is where this nationalism really started. So it's on this cusp of industrialization combined with democratization and this sort of unification.
I'm wondering, so you mentioned like France and England, and I'm wondering when these transitions from like a monarchy to something else, was that just like a sweep across like all of Europe when that occurred?
Well, during Napoleon's reign, yes. I mean, the goal was the stated goal was to spread freedom. And they said, hey, we have our rights, we have our freedom. We've overturned the aristocracy, and we have a republic here in France. And they wanted to spread that across Europe.
Interesting. Because I'm wondering, like, if you did have something that was more free and like a democratic state, and they're interacting with like a monarchy, like, is that even compatible, or does it necessitate your neighbors kind of have a similar structure?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, going back to Civ, right? If you have different ideologies, there's some friction. But think about it. Let's say you're the king of the Holy Roman Empire, or like you're a Habsburg monarch, and you hear that King Louis and Marie Antoinette were beheaded by a revolutionary mob. And the aristocracy is being beheaded, and they're like, now the army is like marching towards your country. Like, this doesn't seem like it's going to turn out well for me.
It's like Wile E. Coyote with a sign.
Yikes! Exactly. So like you see this happening, and if you're the aristocracy, you're probably not too happy about this.
Yeah. Well, the reason I brought that up is because I've also heard some ideas about this whole conflict between like the democracy and freedom and like communist states, and one of the ideas is that democracy can't work if there's a communist state. And one of the evidence that they have is like there's no two democratic countries have ever like gone to war. Ever heard that? Because there's a whole containment idea.
Well, it's a similar thing too, because like during the October Revolution, right, the Russian Marxist Revolution in Russia, they executed the monarchy, but it wasn't like a libertarian revolution in France. It was a Marxist revolution.
Interesting.
I mean, there's still a toppling of the aristocracy, but like, what do you get in its place, I guess, is the question.
Right.
And this is another tangent. Maybe we can come back to this later, but this is what I think makes the American Revolution so special, is that the American Revolution was fundamentally conservative. In this, like, it was revolutionary in the sense that they said, you know, we don't want a king, but it was conservative in the sense that you've been ignoring us for the past 100 years. Please continue to leave us alone.
Yeah.
And then the crown's like, no, you're ours. You're gonna pay our taxes. You're gonna do what we say. And so they're like, no, we want to go back where you had this benign neglect.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's like they started building and getting like their economy going and things, and then now the monarchy is like taking it away from you after you've worked so hard for it.
That's what it feels like, right?
Yeah.
Right. And there are also other concerns too, because it was right after the French and Indian War, where the British had protected the colonies from the French, and they're like, okay, we just paid to defend you, so you know, kick in your fair share of the funding, buddy. So anyways, but back to the whole nationalism thing. So the American Revolution happened, and then the French libertarian types. If I'm not like hesitant to use that word, but right, Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death."
Yeah.
There was a similar sentiment in France, but the only difference was they had this established monarchy that they were living with.
Yeah.
Whereas the Americans, you know, the monarchy was this thing that was far away. I mean, they were still subjects of the crown, but a lot of people had generations of colonists who developed such a independent identity that the imperial force felt like tyranny.
Yeah. And probably another thing that united the states or the colonies was like all different colonies were getting the same treatment.
Yeah.
And then it's like, hey, screw you. We're going to establish our own nation rather than these like separate colonies. We're going to combine against a common adversary to promote an idea of a nation.
Well, and that's the thing. It's America is such a strange country. But like Britain is the United Kingdom. And so you could argue, so they, getting back to the original question, they have gradually evolved a democracy, right? England has gone through so much war back all the way to Roman times, but there are these little like benchmarks where the government slowly evolved. Like you get the Roman law, and then you get the Magna Carta, and then you have like this glorious revolution, and then you have another person overthrow it. Then there's the Parliament with the Lords, and then the House of Commons gets more power, and then you have like these little precedents that rack up over thousands of years.
It's like an organic process where it slowly morphs into something. It's not like, okay, this is how things are gonna go, which is kind of what the Declaration of Independence was like starting from scratch of this is how things are going to be.
Yeah.
Which is pretty uncommon, I think.
Well, and to be fair, like there was the Articles of Confederation first, and that didn't go so well. And then they thought, okay, well, I guess we'll come up with this Constitution thing. Maybe that'll work better. And then after they came up with that, they're like, okay, now we need to add on the Bill of Rights because we need to have rights to ensure that the government doesn't become tyrannical.
Right. And there were also like the idea that the Senate has like equal representation among the colonies despite their sizes, right? And then the House was more based on the population to kind of like barter a deal. So like is whatever the state of the Union back then actually determined a lot of the initial terms of the Constitution and the structure of the government, which I think is pretty interesting. Yeah,
it's definitely a product of the Enlightenment for sure.
Well, I guess what I was saying is like there were some smaller states like Delaware or something was like, or like maybe some other southern state was basically okay. So if we just do this voting thing and it's all based on population, it's like okay, everyone's gonna do what New York says.
Right.
And they're like, no, we're not going to do this. So
Right.
then there was like, okay, well, we'll have the Senate where everyone has like 2 senators. Doesn't matter what state.
Right. It's a compromise for sure.
So it's like what the conditions look like when at the inception determined a lot of what was going on. It wasn't just some total top-down structured idea. It was negotiating with the time and place and context.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only point I was.
Yeah. So nationalism as an ism is the idea of the nation state, where your nation is also your like ethnicity and your language and your political unit. And usually this goes along with a democracy. And the argument is that, well, the most obvious is fascism, is when the ideology goes too far. And then when you go to like ethnic cleansing type of stuff, right, that's not good. And so the people that argue against nationalism use that as example to say, hey, like this nationalism stuff is bad business. It doesn't go anywhere good. It always leads to conflict and war. The world would be better if we didn't have nationalism.
Okay. So nationalism leading to fascism, that's the fear, or some kind of dictatorial state that just wants to basically take over everything.
Yeah.
Okay. So what can you define exactly what fascism is? Other than to me, it almost sounds like a dictatorship.
Yeah, it is. It's a dictatorship, but communism is also a dictatorship, right? It's a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And there's actually a really cool video on fascism. I can link it in the description by a guy named Chapman. And he distinguishes Italian fascism from German fascism. But fundamentally, the two big ideas is there's the economic structure, which is usually capitalism or something like capitalism, not always entirely, but that you have some sort of free market going on. It's interesting because Nazism was originally called National Socialism.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of socialist identity. But the other thing is what he calls blood and soil nationalism, which is like, this is our motherland, this is our blood, this is our soil. And there's this sense of like identity tied to the land.
Got it.
So you have a dictator, a blood and soil nationalism, and maybe some capitalism with a little bit of socialism.
Capitalism with a little bit of socialism. But it seemed like there was something that all the Germans in the time, not all, but I'd say the vast majority had such a strong national identity and everyone was working together. That was part of the strength of that state, right?
Oh, well, let's not forget Japan, right? Because they went fascist as well. And that's another thing I want to return to. So there's this idea that there's this collective strength, and that's arguably one of the strengths of nationalism is that it unites people, it gets them organized and going in the same direction. Yeah,
I mean, I've heard some statistics or some kind of tidbit where like the German economy and productivity during that time was just like mind-boggling.
It was a miracle, an economic miracle.
Like if you look at the GDP, the thing is just like skyrocket, and it's like, whoa, how do you get people motivated in that work ethic?
I mean, and remember, this was during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So I almost think of it like the electric paddles on the heart, where you just like jumpstart the heart of the nation.
Yeah, it would be so cool to somehow harness that kind of like cooperation organization, but without the crazy dictator that wants to like ethnically cleanse groups of people.
Yeah, there's this guy, what's his name? I think it's William James. Anyways, he said, we need to find a moral equivalent to war. And this moral equivalent to war is exactly that. Like, how do we unite people? How do we get people to be cooperate and productive without war?
Yeah. That's really interesting because at the very onset we were talking about how maybe these barbarian invaders is what actually brought people together. So
Mhm.
like some kind of like violence or is involved in wars. I don't know. Like that would be an interesting silver bullet, I guess, if we can figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, and we also live in a strange time where like people are creating online
Hmm.
businesses and they're like outsourcing their videography to people in Brazil, and they're like their sound editor might be from
Hmm.
Hungary, and you have this interconnected global commerce.
Yeah.
And so that kind of suggests that maybe nationalism per se is outdated. Like we still have nations and maybe a
Hmm.
sense of patriotism, but like nationalism
Mm.
might be outdated.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have like I think a lot of the Trump's movement is an attempt to kind of recapture the American spirit,
Hmm.
right? The
Hmm.
slogan is "Make America Great Again,"
Right.
or another slogan is "America First."
Hmm.
And then this idea that we have a national identity, we need to
Hmm.
do what's good for America first, and then once we're healthy, then we can help other people.
Right. That makes sense. I'm also thinking now, like we talked last week about the Fermi paradox, the existence of potential existence of aliens, and where are they?
Yeah.
And I was just thinking of this outside uh, adversary that
Mm-hmm.
might bring people together. So that would be interesting if it actually was confirmed that there's some kind of alien life. How would that impact humanity? Maybe that could be the thing that could have people work together more.
Right? I mean, that was, I think, Carl Sagan's vision.
Yeah.
Not necessarily aliens per se, but like in Contact, the fiction, the story of Contact,
Hmm.
right? They discovered this signal from outer space. And there's this international convention to build this machine to like
Hmm.
and understand what these extraterrestrials wanted.
Yeah. I think it's something like that. That's just like could be dramatic in terms of maybe mitigating wars, but or causing a global panic as well.
Well,
That's
and
like,
and it's really interesting or sad, I guess, the whole COVID deal. Like a
mm,
lot of people thought, hey, this is a global crisis. This is our time to come together.
mm-hmm.
And it didn't seem like that happened. And it was all complicated with politics. And then you have like social media, and it just seemed like more chaos. But
Yeah. I think the problem is for however other nationalist systems work to promote togetherness, everyone kind of has to be agree on the same page to move forward, not like mandated to do something.
right,
That's probably where you got some feathers got ruffled.
for sure. And yeah, and actually, this brings me to another point I wanted to make, and we can. I don't know if you want to transition into this.
Sure.
So the topic is propaganda. So I
Mm-hmm.
read this fascinating book called Propaganda by a
Mm-hmm.
guy named Edward Bernays.
Mm.
So I think he wrote several books, but this particular one he wrote I think it was right after World War One.
Bernays, isn't he like a father of advertising or something?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
and he was like a cousin of Freud or something like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. 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 I did. Yeah.
And I think he's the one that suggested like sex and
Mm-hmm.
advertising.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote this book called Propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about it is that it was written before World War II. That's really important to know
Mm-hmm.
because propaganda was a big part of World
Yeah.
War II.
Huge.
So it was just like a budding technology because
Mm-hmm.
we just invented radio. I mean, printing press had been around for a while, but like television and radio were new. And so World War II really capitalized on that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, here's a quote from his book. He said, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country.
And like a puppeteer, like leading the herd in the background without your knowledge.
Yeah, well, and he makes the argument that it's a necessity and almost what would you say, a noble cause, that the people who are in charge must lead the sheep, because if we don't, there'll be chaos, and that's bad.
Yeah. It's so tough, especially like in a World War II situation. And it's like really dire consequences of the outcomes of these conflicts. So maybe it's worth, loose lips sink ships and all these like pictures of these Japanese with vampire teeth, like with horns and like all that stuff. Maybe that, I don't know. It seems like horrible and not good. But if it actually brings people together to fight for a common cause for survival, I don't know. That gets pretty murky, right?
Yeah. I mean, and you could argue that it's just a tool, and like any tool, you can use it or abuse it. And I mean, yeah. But see here's to me the moral quandary or the paradox. And this is not new. I mean, this is the same problem in Greece with like the sophists, right? So they like Athenians invented democracy, and so then they started having rhetoricians and like smooth talkers and demagogues that would just sway people. And the whole point of a democracy is that people would vote for what would improve things for the group, and everyone was participating. Everyone had a stake in it, and the collective intelligence was somehow more wise than an individual ruler. And that's the whole point of a democracy. But if you have something like propaganda, then you have somebody makes the decision, and then they tell people what to think and feel, so they go along with it.
Right.
I think Chomsky has a book called Engineering Consent or Manufacturing Consent, something like that.
Yeah. It's disturbing.
Well,
sure.
but the point is, like, ideally, when you have a democracy, and maybe this is why people argue a republic is better than a democracy, because you have people who hash it out, and they share ideas, and then through that exchange, then you arrive at the consensus decision of what's going to be best.
Yeah. And that's what's also kind of frustrating with like these political campaigns in the United States, is most of it is how can we like just convince people to get their vote, and they're using rhetoric and arguments that doesn't matter as long as they check the box, right? And I don't care about like all the other things.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, and the thing personally that's been really weird is the political like realignment. So for a long time, I've been a progressive Democrat, and it seemed like the Democrats were the party of the working class. And when I was growing up, it was like the Republicans are big business. They're in money with the bankers, and
there's like labor unions and trying to fight for the man or the common guy.
Yeah, and now it seems like it's switched around where the Democrats are like in bed with the big tech corporations, and the Republicans are like populists fighting for the working class.
Yeah.
I don't even... What?
Wasn't there also a similar reversal back in the day with like Lincoln, and they're like the Republicans and Democrats also had it was like now we're like flipped back to how, I forget. But I've heard of that happening before.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's personally been confusing to sort out.
Yeah.
But back to your point, it's like, on the one hand, it's just getting people to check a box, but at the same time, it's like the meaning of the box is changing. So.
Yeah. It's like, what do I believe in? And then how can I vote for those beliefs rather than this whole like political...
Well, and I don't want to get too much into American politics. Maybe we can get into that later. But the two-party system makes me crazy.
Yeah.
Because it's like whatever position the Republicans take, the Democrats have to take the opposite. Yeah. And then whatever position the Democrats take, the Republicans have to take the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about like game theory a little while back, and this is an interesting game between two players. We're talking about zero-sum game. That's what it seems like. It's like winner take all.
Well, the reason is because we have an electoral college. So in let's say the British system, they have a parliamentary system. So you get a member of parliament that's elected, and like they're your representative, right? Because we have the House of Representatives based on a precinct or whatever, and then you get elected to Parliament, and then within Parliament you have these political coalitions, and then they within themselves pick the prime minister. So it's not a direct election of the people. It's election of, let's say, experts and political coalitions between various parties that elect a prime minister. And I actually like that system better because it gives more voice to the local needs in the representatives. And then between the experts, let's say, the deals are hashed out. So let's say you're part of the Green Party and I'm part of the Democratic Party. In the United States, if you want to get something done, you have to decide. Are you going to park your issues with the Democrats? Or are you going to park your issues with the Republicans? Right. Because otherwise, you're not going to influence.
Even if you talk to someone else on the other side, then you're like banned or like admonished by the party.
Well, that's like extra political stuff beyond just the two-party system.
Right.
But like in the parliamentary system, what happens is like the Green Party and the Labour Party would say, okay, we'll combine our forces and then we're going to elect this prime minister, and then both of our interests are served by this person. So this negotiation and coalition building happens after the representative election, whereas in America, the coalition is essentially worked out before the election.
Interesting.
Anyhow, back to nationalism.
Yeah. So we were talking. So nationalism. We were talking about like propaganda, right? And manufacturing consent. This Bernays, and that I think is relevant to the idea of nationalism that you were talking about.
Yeah. So his argument is that it's necessary. It's a requirement.
Yeah.
That if you have a democracy, you have to have propaganda. And part of it kind of sounds a little sinister, like don't let the sheep think for themselves.
Yeah, right.
But his argument is that it's pragmatic. Like if you want something that's functional, if you want people to be able to cooperate and go in the same direction, you have to have a way to get people to buy into this.
Right. You need a slogan. You need like a little symbol you can put on your shirt and say, "Hey, I'm part of this thing." And, yeah.
I'll read this quote again.
Yeah.
The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country.
It's like, let's go Illuminati. The hidden hand.
But it's interesting because, like, one argument is that nationalism's outdated. We don't need it anymore. And I'd mentioned this before, right? In the song Imagine by John Lennon, he says, imagine there are no countries.
Yeah.
Right? It's easy if you try.
Yikes. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that would be an interesting global experiment to do, but I'm pretty sure it would descend into anarchy pretty quickly. But who knows? Maybe self-organization. Who knows what would happen, right?
Well, we in some sense, we are in an anarchy. I mean, not totally, but like with everyone being hyper-connected, there's this struggle between freedom and chaos. When you have too much freedom, it's chaos. But if you have too much order, it's tyranny.
Yeah.
So how do you strike that balance?
Yeah. So now I'm thinking, so Bernays is talking about like propaganda and basically the unseen hand that's tipping the scale. So in modern society, it seems like those are like the Facebook, social media kinds of things that are happening now. So it's more like these tech people are the ones that are manipulating feeds and recommendations and showing comments in certain ways. And that's been discussed quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, what's also really interesting is, and Peterson talks about this a lot, how traditional media is falling apart. Like how many people subscribe to a newspaper to be delivered to their door?
Yeah.
Almost nobody.
Right.
And then like how many people watch TV to get the news?
Yeah.
Almost everybody gets their news from podcasts these days.
Yeah, I've tried to go watch like, news on TV with dad a few times, and I'm just like so cringy because everything they say is some soundbite propaganda stuff. It's just like, what are you guys actually doing or talking about here? And it doesn't matter with left or right. It's just both equally just ridiculous.
Have I shown you that video about this is dangerous for our democracy?
Maybe.
I'll link it in the description if I find it. But it's creepy because you have like 50 different people saying the same thing with a smile, and you think like, oh, this is just the local news, but it's just when you see it like organized in this way, it's completely scripted.
Oh, you did show me that. Yeah.
And then another thing, I mean, just in terms of the weird place we're in with the deep fake stuff, like the Peterson makes this point. Maybe I'll link this video too. Like soon we're going to be in a place where it's going to be hard to tell what's a legitimate video and what's not.
Yeah. It could be like really early on with Orson Welles. He did like a War of the Worlds thing broadcast, and people thought it was real and they started freaking out or whatever. Like deepfake could potentially do that. Like if the president says, the president, which is like an AI deepfake of some kind, says something totally inflammatory, like it's scary.
And then that one argument is, well, we'll get a technology to verify the technology, but then you get a hacker to, like have this like, arms race.
They could probably do some authentication thing with like some NFT blockchain to maybe like put your stamp, like this is from this specific source and we got the blockchain.
Eyeball scan. You're not an android.
Yeah. Oh man. It's going to be a wild ride with all this AI stuff coming up, and we'll see. Yeah, it's going to be like some propaganda like 2.0, right? Maybe like 10.0. It's going to be crazy.
So back to this nationalism thing.
Yeah.
I think the United States is very unique in the sense that our nationalism, or it's a civic nationalism, in the sense that you become a citizen of the United States, and that identity is a political identity, right? So it's not like, and we have all the hyphenated, like Mexican American, Chinese American, right? The American part there implies that it's not about ethnicity, it's not about language, it's about you're part of this national identity, and the fundamental foundation is, right, liberty, like freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so the United States is interesting in that sense. Whereas Europe, like a lot of these, the problems with nationalism came up when you have like Italy is for the Italians, Germany is for the Germans, France is for the French, Japan is for the Japanese.
That's true. I mean, there's a lot of these automatic. I mean, even the way physical features from certain countries that have been long established for thousands of years. I mean, that's like an automatic commonality you have. But in the United States, it's this huge diversity of all sorts of people. It's not about those things. It's about, the ideas and concepts and, freedom for all. And that takes a little bit more like top-down like reason to get through, and you have to have some suppression of your primitive brain to overcome those things.
Well, yeah. Well, two things. I love that the Pledge of Allegiance ends with liberty and justice for all, because those are like the two poles that make it work.
Yeah.
Because, right, if you have too much chaos, that's bad. Well, that's why you need justice. But if you have too much tyranny, that's bad. That's why you need liberty.
It's interesting, yeah. I think in general, well, I was going to say that
and just to be clear, nationalism is not the same thing as patriotism. So I think patriotism is a sense of gratitude for what your country provides. And there's a little like team spirit too, this sort of like tribal, pride, like the Olympics, this is my team, I'm rooting for my team. Okay. I think that's part of patriotism too.
Yeah, for sure. they're pretty similar, but I guess so. The major difference maybe is the patriotism isn't concerned about like any specific structure or how things are put together. It's just like raw mentality, like the morale, like the patriot. Being patriotic is just let's go team. Where nationalism maybe has a lot more details in terms of like how things are organized and put together and structured.
It's a lot more intense, I think. I mean, patriots die for their country too, but it's like it's the idea that you're of blood and soil, right? That it's in your DNA, your tribe, your blood, and it's connected to a geographic location. And we talked too about how in terms of capitalism, right, that this idea of territory and ownership is embedded into our like deep nervous system, right? The way like dogs have their territory and like lions have their territory. Like it's very visceral and instinctive.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole like Israel-Palestine thing too. It's about the land in it. And man, that's a tough one as well.
Well, and the Native American thing. It's like, hey, this is our ancestral land.
Yeah.
And history shows that can lead to blood pretty quickly when you get into that. Right. And so this is what I want to talk about too in terms of like the end of nationalism. I know Canadians, I think it was Justin Trudeau who said that Canada is a post-national country. And I think the whole idea of the European Union is to like tone down the nationalism and say, we're going to view our identity as being a collective of Europeans instead of viewing ourselves as different nations.
Right.
And part of that is to tone down the violence, but also to create an economic bloc that can compete with the United States.
The euro being pretty strong.
So historically speaking, that makes sense. On the other hand, I can sympathize with people who don't like this top-down puppeteering.
Yeah.
It's like a bunch of people in Brussels has decided that your national identity should no longer exist. And so now you need to be a European and stop being French. It's like, but I'm French.
Right.
It's like culture. We have a choice in our culture, right?
Yeah. It's like that. Well, that's like a generational thing. You can't just come up and do that with someone. So maybe they start the EU with just like a economic thing on top, and that's all it is. You're still maintain all your culture and everything. But
for sure. So
eventually, maybe the idea is to have more of like a new world order.
So there's a fascinating book that Jimmy recommended to me. I'll put it in the description too. It's called "The Weak Suffer What They Must," and so this is a quote from this Roman general. I forget his name, but he was like conquering a territory. And they were asking him if he would have mercy and like, why is he doing this? And he said, the strong take what they can and the weak suffer what they must.
Yikes.
I know, it was pretty yikes for
like
sure.
Wile E. Coyote moment.
Exactly. Yeah.
Eep.
Let them eat cake, essentially. But so the whole argument of this book is that the European Union is problematic because it's a financial union, not a political union. And he contrasts it with the United States. So the United States first was a political union, right? There's this Revolutionary War, then this Constitution, and we didn't get like a federal bank and a like universal currency until I think the universal federal currency was after the Civil War. Because like each state had its own different currency.
Oh, that would be maddening.
Yeah, right. So it wasn't until after the Civil War that the federal government came up with like the Fed and like all these different like a national currency and a national bank.
Well, didn't Andrew Jackson push against some central bank? That was
that was
before.
Like that also goes back to Hamilton.
Yeah,
like there's been this friction for sure.
Yeah.
For a long time. But anyways, So his argument is that the European Union is having problems because it's an economic union without being a political union. And so he used to be the finance minister of Greece, and Greece is going bankrupt. And it's like, okay, so Germany's perspective is you need to be more responsible. This is like the grasshopper and the ants, and you need to work hard and save money, and that's what you need to do.
The grasshopper and the ants? I don't know that.
That's Aesop's fable.
Oh, okay.
where the ants were working hard and the grasshoppers just singing "The world owes me a living."
Okay. Gotcha.
And so where was I? European Union, Greece is having trouble, or Spain or Ireland, right? They're having economic problems, and then Germany and France are like, well, why should we help you?
Yeah.
And like how they don't have a Senate to like have representative voices and negotiate this thing. So it's this mess because like how do you negotiate that? How do you handle that? And it becomes this weird like economic power game.
Yeah. Right. So the whole like Germany and France is like Greece is sucking off the teats of the rest of us kind of thing.
Well, right. And so they're like, well, you just need to suck it up and be more responsible.
Right. Oy.
And his point was that, ironically, that was exactly what happened after World War One. That's exactly what drove Germany to be a fascist, is like this sense of resentment towards the West. And not coincidentally, at the time, Greece was developing this like nationalist party, like Greek for Greece, and you know, we need to be independent from these abusive bankers. And it's like, oh gosh, this again. So his point, he made 2 points. Like it would be nice if there was a political integration as well as this economic integration. And he again admires the way the United States does things, because let's say, you know, Alabama's going under economically. The federal government can say, well, we're going to move our airplane manufacturing plants to Alabama. And so the federal government can spend money and sort of jumpstart the economy of a state that's falling behind.
Right.
And I think he called it recycling. There's this like recycling of funds and helping within the United States. But you don't have that same mechanism within Europe.
Yeah. So you're still kind of like contained and have some self-autonomy, but then there's a higher level above that can kind of fill in when times are rough for different states. Or like if you have like a hurricane kind of thing, the federal government can come in and offer relief. That kind of thing.
Right. And they do have rescue things too, but another big issue recently has been the issue of immigration. And the idea with the European Union is that there's free migration, and the idea behind that is that you could balance out the labor supply, right? So if there's like cheap labor in Germany, then the French people can go work in Germany, and then as soon as things change, they can move back to France. And there's this like it increases the economic thriving when you have free labor migration.
Right. And maybe not as much like bureaucracy with different visas and things like that.
Yeah. The problem is when a country, let's say Greece, or well, let's say, we'll just pick on Greece. Let's say Greece is like super lax, like, oh yeah, come on in. Anyone can come into Greece, no problem. And then people get into Greece and then they migrate to Germany and then they go wherever they want. So it turns out like the country with like the lowest standards, or, you know, I shouldn't say lowest standards, but migrants can figure out how to game the system by getting into the country that has the easiest access, and then from there go to wherever they want in Europe. And this is a big part of Brexit, because a lot of the British people are saying, hey, you know, we don't want to be part of this European Union. Like, this isn't really, it's not as good for us as it is for them. They're taking more than they're giving. We want to have the determination to decide who we let in and out of our country. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And so Britain Brexited.
Right. And I know that was a huge deal, but I didn't understand all the reasonings behind it. But it was, a lot of it had to do with immigration and being compelled to act in a certain way. Even when their own country doesn't want things to go that way.
Right. So part of it's economic, but a part of it's also immigration.
Interesting. So what is that called when you have like a European Union? And is that like nationalism, when you're combining smaller nations into a larger identity?
I don't know, because to me it seems artificial, and like it seems like puppeteering. We talked about that. It's like some enlightened people decided, we're going to lump you together and we're going to create a new identity and you're going to love it.
Right.
And I think we actually talked about this before. Like my college did a rebranding and they like changed the icon, the mascot a little bit, and they like tweaked it around. And then they had this like alumni celebration with the new branding. And I was like, for some reason, I don't feel really loyal and like connected to this new brand.
Right.
You just like snapped your fingers and you're expecting people to like have sentimental connections to this.
Right. When they grew up with it like 10, 20 years ago or something.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can sympathize with a lot of Europeans who feel that they're being manipulated by, these international forces. And then, I mean, and that's kind of where we're at. I think that's the same issue in the United States, but it's not like, I think that's the fundamental divide between the Trump Make America Great Again type people and then the democratic, more like global commerce kind of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're trying to figure out. Like, what's the appropriate...
Yeah, the balance between what, order and chaos, or would you say justice and liberty? Trying to find that balance, and it's always in flux, right? Until you get to some equilibrium. But I feel like right now it's in a big flux. I'm very curious to see where it will go.
And personally, my view is it has to do with development. Like, and I think we talked about Erickson, right? And how there are different levels of development. It's like, okay, you're an infant. You need to have basic trust, right? You need to have a secure attachment with your mom. Like, that's your goal in life. And then after that, okay, maybe you can bond with your peers and like figure out how to navigate your family. And then once you figure out how to have reciprocal relationships, right? Trade and take turns, then you go up and you have like this tribal competitiveness in middle school, right? Then your hormones turn on and you're like, oh, I'm becoming an adult. And then you realize, oh, I'm part of a nation. Like, I'm part of a tribe and a nation. And then you realize, oh, I'm part of a planet. And I think a lot of people who are naive in the sense that they don't understand developmental psychology try to raise kids to be citizens of the world. It's like, no, you have to understand how to share with your friends. Like, that's the developmental step. Then you need to master the language that your parents speak. And then maybe you can understand like how to navigate the schoolyard.
But then, okay, so then the concept is just to throw you straight into the world citizen.
Right. Or like teaching first graders anti-racism. It's like first graders' brains aren't even on that wavelength yet. And or like giving second graders anti-rape training. They're second graders. Like, that's not appropriate for their age.
Right.
So, and I'm not saying anti-rape trainings are bad, and I'm not saying anti-racism training is bad. I'm just saying there's an appropriate time and place for that. So the analogy is, before getting to this global stage, you need a national stage, right? I think it's healthy to have a sense of belonging, a healthy sense of gratitude and patriotism, and then from that foundation, then you can be a citizen of the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's the spirit of the Olympics, right? Everyone is contributing to this like global competition where, there's mutual respect of difference, but also similarity.
Right. So just to be clear, I think what I'm hearing is that this idea of like personal psychological development it can be an analogy for like the development of a nation.
For sure.
Yeah. So that you're making that parallel, but also the individuals within that nation also being presented with certain things at certain ages.
Well, and I don't think technically there is such a thing as a nation. They're just groups of people who share a way of thinking and are going along with rules, laws unconsciously. I mean, that's what a culture is.
Right.
And that comes from this developmental evolution of people as individuals. I mean, you can categorize it as a nation, but it's all just a bunch of individuals on a developmental trajectory.
Right. And at each stage during that development, if we're talking about Erickson's, it can go good or bad, and you could have problems in the way the country develops. So even if you're actually at a later stage, you might have a poor foundation that might not work well. So maybe Maslow's hierarchy of needs might be a little.
Maybe, but getting back to this
Yeah.
point, I mean, some people have criticized American politics, perhaps rightly, that it seems like high school popularity contests.
Yeah.
Like Trump seems like a middle school bully who dominates people by calling them names.
Right. Pretty ridiculous.
But the point is that means that some people are stuck in that mentality, right?
Yeah.
And if we can grow beyond that, then we can get into this like international cooperation. That's my point.
I think it's a good point. Yeah, I don't disagree. And then I don't know. You always hear about these idea of like a global government, and that's always been seen as like Big Brother, scary, like New World Order. Well, that's how I hear about it. I haven't heard of a lot of people promoting something like that before, like in a serious, like let's make a world government and it'll be better.
Yeah. Well, on the one hand, I hear you because I know there are a lot of Christians in particular who talk about, prophecies and revelation and like, you shall not buy or sell by the mark of the beast and like one world government to rule them all kind of thing. Tower of Babel, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, that makes sense. However, or I should say, and historically, this has been an effort that's been ongoing for a long time. So before World War One, or maybe it was after World War One. I think it was around the time of World War One. There was an attempt to create the League of Nations, which is exactly that. Like you have these independent nations that come together and have a sort of Congress, and then from there they can legislate. Like what are the rules of war? What can you not do?
Right. It's like a global courtroom, right? So if like, oh, you can't be doing that, like crime against humanity kind of thing. Well, we're gonna. But the thing is, yeah, I guess the League of Nations didn't have any teeth. It's like so that they can say that you've committed a crime, but then what?
Right, and then there's the United Nations, which is sort of the League of Nations 2.0. And there's challenges with that too. Like historically, I don't know if you remember this, but like George Bush decided to invade Iraq, and did he get approval?
No.
It's like which is again going back to this European Union problem. Like you have this economic union, but not necessarily a political union. So how do you integrate the political in a way that people are cooperating, and not in a way that you're like pandering or placating people like, okay, your voice matters, your vote is really really important, okay, now we're going to give them the propaganda to get what we want,
right?
So yeah, that's tricky. Like and then in terms of like even economic enforcement, like there's challenges. Like Trump's always talking about the currency exchange with China and how they're manipulating markets. It's like, how do you enforce that? Like, there's no like consensus or ruling body that's gonna enforce or like piracy. Like if someone's technology or patent that's protected under American federal law is stolen and copied in India, like what are you gonna do about it?
Yeah, I guess the only thing, you can't send in an army. I guess UN have like some forces, but it's silly. But sanctions, I think, is typically what happens, right? So like the global community of nations says, okay, we're not going to play nice with you anymore on the playground. We're not going to trade with you and share our stuff. And that's kind of their only recourse to.
Well, nonviolent recourse anyway.
I don't know, but that's just, so the UN doesn't really have like I said, a military force, right? There's like a small task force type of thing.
Yeah.
But it's more like humanitarian, not to go in there and like spank the bad guys.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's tricky. But my point is there's an effort, right? That's an effort to create a world government. But it's certainly not quite there yet. And there are also other.
I didn't consider it as like an effort to create a world government, but it was more just like a means of communication between countries. But I guess that's where it starts, and then maybe, as things develop. Yeah, interesting.
And then you have the International Monetary Fund and then the World Health Organization, which are all these organizations, but it's like, okay, where's your authority coming from exactly?
Just trying to get people on board. I mean, I guess it's a valiant effort, but that sounds pretty tough, especially when it comes to who's calling the shots and who's going to listen. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's even more complicated by technology. It's like, what do you do about Bitcoin? Like, what do you do about Ethereum?
Right. When you just totally sideline all regulations.
Right, all regulatory bodies or like I don't know what you call it, but yeah. So, anyways, this topic is fascinating to me. It's ultra relevant too, I think, and yeah. So, what do we do about nationalism? I think a national identity in terms of patriotism is useful and helpful, and it's a necessary step in development. We shouldn't just abolish it. I think it's a bad idea. But on top of that, as a next level, have an option for this international identity. This is sort of global consciousness, like the Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot. I love that book. And when the moon landing looked back at Earth, it's like this little blue dot.
And that's where all the stuff is going down.
It just reframes it. It's like you realize how small and fragile life is, and when you're up front and close and personal, it feels like we're so different. And his point was that with that perspective shift, we're actually living on a very tiny planet, and this is our one Eden amidst the darkness.
Right. And like you said, probably the same reason he was so interested in the search for extraterrestrial life, just to put things in a larger context of what are we doing here on Earth? Let's get it together. Literally together. So really fascinating. Like, this is very educational for me, because I just had like associations and ideas about like nationalism and all these different connections. But it's very relevant in today, and it's going to continue to be relevant, I think, for a long time.
Oh yeah, man, this is an election year, so we'll see what happens.
Buckle up, kiddos.
Prepare for the propaganda. It's coming.
Cool. Anything else you want to add, or how are you feeling?
That seems a good place to stop. I would also like to encourage people, comment, please. If you have any questions, I want to be more active on the channel, and we can get some threads going. Also, if you have some topics that you'd like to explore more, give us ideas, what you want to hear about, what you'd like to see expanded, let us know. And so remember, YouTube is it's a communication platform. Like, it's not just a one-way broadcast. So comment what you like, what you don't like, what you're curious about, what you want to see more of, what you want to see less of. And let's bring more people into the conversation.
Yeah, I think that would be absolutely great, because we're always trying to think of things that are interesting and also relevant, and we have ideas between ourselves that we find interesting, but I'd be curious about our audience as well. So yeah, please do. And
all right, always be curious.
Yes.